All right, well, you all have your food now, so now you have to pay for your indiscretion and you have to listen to me for a while, okay? So my name is Ben Smith. I'm a irrigation specialist. I've spent almost 10 years here in the Valley. Just recently moved up into the Pacific Northwest to start my own company up there called Potentials Ag, where I do irrigation advising. So I'm happy to be able to continue working with Hortow in doing these seminars and making some training and education material. And glad that you're all here. So I'm definitely going to be building on things that we spoke in our last seminar, but that's okay because we can run through a few things quick at the beginning. Just helps me to know where to start. But today the topic is post-harvest irrigation, and you know, it's pretty timely to be talking about post-harvest irrigation when you haven't started harvest yet. However, we know how it goes, and we know that once the shakers get in the field, that everyone will be unavailable for quite a while here. So we wanted to get ahead of it and to talk about what we could be doing to have a more successful irrigation and more successful season to come. Very good. That also gives me an idea. So we're going to focus on almonds today, but the principles we talk about really apply to all crops. And so we'll go from there. All right, considerations for spring. Any problems there? We're here to talk about fall, right? So why did I put in considerations for spring? And that is because fall care is the #1 most important consideration for spring. Now's the time for us to set ourselves up to have a successful spring. A lot of this has to do with the principle of source to sink, okay? So if you look inside a plant system, what is the merchandise? What's the cash, the money that a plant uses within itself? Any thoughts on that? What's that?
Fruit.
The fruit's what we use within the plant, between roots and leaves and fruit. What is it exchanging? What does a plant care about? Nutrients, sugar is the biggest thing. That's what a plant makes, right? Is sugar. So sugar is the currency of a plant. So when we're talking about this, we want to talk about the source of that currency versus the sink. And this is a pretty easy concept for us as farmers because we're the source of food. So we're the source. The sink is the place where it's consumed. The home, the restaurants, the businesses, the place that it's being used. Within a plant, there's also a source and sink. There's where the sugar originates. There's a place where it's used up. So let's look at different periods of the season and talk a little bit about what the source is and what the sink is at that period. So we're going to look at stages. It's going to give me troubles. Stages. Okay, and then we're going to talk about the sink and the source. Now, most of us think of the beginning of the crop cycle as bloom, but I actually like to think of the beginning as nut fill, or rather early nut stages and nut fill. So during nut fill or nut growth, what is the sink of that currency of sugar in the plant? Where is it going? What's that? The nuts, the fruit. So during this period, all of the energy is focused more than anything going to the fruit. That's what it's growing. That's what it's developing. What's the source of that sugar during this period? Where is the sugar created, or where is it shipped from? Leaves. So during this period, leaves are up, they're mature, they're growing. That's their whole job, right? That's photosynthesis, is they take CO2 and they take sunlight and they make sugar, right? So that's the source of the product in the plant system. All right, let's move to a different stage. We're going to move to post-harvest now. Okay, during post-harvest, is the fruit or the nut, is it still the sink of that sugar? Why not? It's not there, right? So it can't be. So the crop, the plant is still making sugars. So where is it taking those sugars? What does it do with them? It stores them. Where does it store them?
Wood.
Oops. Roots in the wood as well, yeah. Storage. And what's the source of that sugar? Still the leaves. Very good. All right, so let's move now. Let's go to the next season, and let's talk about bloom and bud break. So this is bloom. It's early growth of the nut. It's leaf development, leaf growth. What is the sink? Where does the energy go during this time of the year?
Wow.
What's that?
Wow.
Flowers. The bloom is one of it. Anything else? What's that? The leaves. All right, so we've listed the previous two stages. We've listed the sources, the leaves. Why is it that the leaves are now the sink? Why are they using the sugars? If they don't have any leaves, they got to make them from something. So the thing that's amazing here to me is that the plant at this point has no factory. The leaves are the factory. It has no factory, and yet it still has the energy to build a factory. That's a pretty serious loan that the tree takes. So without leaves, what's the source of sugar?
Storage.
The roots and storage. That's the reason that fall care is so important, is because everything that you want to accomplish in the spring is dependent upon what you do in the fall. Because that's the time when the tree has the extra capacity to be able to create and store sugars. I think a lot of times we get to this stage in the spring, we see some leaves on that tree, and we start to feel pretty good. We feel like, okay, we got leaves again. The tree's going to be okay. It can take off. It can grow. But I think we give way more value to those leaves than is deserved. Because truthfully, those leaves, as long as they're immature, as long as they're still growing, they take more from the plant than they're able to give. Because it requires a lot of energy to make this happen. And so, truthfully, these leaves don't start giving back to the plant until they harden off. Now, the stage, what I usually look for to see a hardened off plant is those leaves, instead of being kind of this nice lime green, they turn darker green. And if you play with them, they go from being really soft to being more firm and kind of being able to snap. But that's when the trees are mature. That's when they're making sugar. That's when they're giving back to the tree. But it's a pretty amazing process if you think about it. In almonds, bloom happens mid-February, and hardening off doesn't happen usually until the first part of May to mid-May. So you've got February, March, April, and May. So 3 months, 3 to almost 4 months, where the tree is not able to produce the sugar it needs. Now let's not forget what's going on at this period. During this period, leaves are growing, bloom is happening, root flush is happening, and the nuts, the fruits, are in their early developmental stages. There's a tremendous amount of energy that's required during this time. Now, one thing I think is cool is our trees have a lot of potential to store energy. Years ago, I helped a friend. He had a few acres of apples in his backyard, and he wanted to take them out. So we went in the field in the fall, and we cut them into logs. And we just left it in the ground. It snowed, and we weren't able to get the logs out before the snow. So they sat there all winter. Come spring, the snow melted off. And the amazing thing was that these logs out in the fields, they actually grew. They grew shoots. They had shoots come off from them. And it wasn't like they had little shoots, but they were able to grow 5 and 6 foot shoots just from the sugars that they had stored within the log, because they didn't have anything else to be able to draw upon. And so there's a lot of energy that we can store in the tree if we manage it properly. So the question becomes, how do we supply the energy in the spring? And it does begin with the post-harvest care. So the question is how are we doing preparing for the spring here in this picture? Not too great, right? It looks pretty rough. However, that's pretty normal to see. And to some degree, it can't be avoided. We have to dry down our trees to harvest. They have to go through some stress. But it can really add up because it's a critical time for the trees, because the sink that's the period where there isn't fruit on the tree and there's actually excess sugars to be able to store. One thing to keep in mind as well is that come September, even though it's still pretty warm during the day, we start having cooler temperatures at night. And those cooler evening and night temperatures actually stimulate the trees and cause them to store those sugars. So we want our trees to be productive in the fall. We want them to be taking advantage of that. Now, I wish I had a paper written out on it, but I know of a company that provides some shade cloth and things like that. They did kind of an experiment on their own. Their thought was with cherries, we waste a lot of water of cherries late in the season. We harvest them in May, they sit all summer, and then they just keep using water in the fall. So they thought, why don't we just put a cherry to sleep early and save all that fall water? That should be a pretty good deal. So early September, they went out, they put zinc sulfate on the leaves, they knocked the leaves off, and then they covered it in black fabric, completely covered it. And they were successful. They put the tree to sleep. Now, the thing that's amazing is that, during the winter, after everything was dormant, they took off the black and they waited for spring, and the tree woke back up. However, when it woke back up, it had tiny leaves and it had tiny little blossoms, and not many of them. And then the fruit that came from it were tiny little fruit. Nothing that came off of that tree was worthy of being sold, of a quality that could be sold. And the reason is because that tree missed its opportunity in the fall to store its sugars to prepare for the spring. So much of our fruit development is dependent upon those the sugars that we're able to store at that time. Now, if you think about that, it's not long. You see it a little bit still, but the time's not long past from where once harvest was done, everybody wanted to put zinc sulfate on the trees to knock the leaves off and to put them to sleep. That was kind of the common practice. Now, thankfully, we're moving more and more away from that, but it caused some trouble for us to go in and to knock the leaves off so early. So the question I have for you is, harvest ends when? For almonds, let's say. Late September, early October usually, right? Unless it's a really rainy year. And how long then before the tree loses its leaves and goes to sleep? 30 days? What I've come to rely on is that usually it's around Christmas. Some years it might be a little early, it might be Thanksgiving, but the last several years, there's leaves on the trees all the way till Christmas. And somewhere around the new year, they actually come off. That's a lot of time. And if we think about that, if we get done with harvest in September, and we expect our trees to just last on with whatever they have left over after that, we've got October, November, December, 3 months where those trees are still active. They're still growing. They're still producing sugars that we could be taking advantage of that we don't if we don't irrigate them properly. That's 3 months where that tree could have been creating and storing sugars that it could use in the spring. So I'm going to need a little bit of participation from you guys. I'm hoping to get some of you to offer some info about your farm a little bit, but it'll make it a lot more fun. But let me just ask you real quick, how much water do you put on post-harvest? You got done, nuts are up out of the field. What do you do now? How many hours of water do you put on your fields? So one thing, I'm not judging anyone here. One thing I recognize is that we've done things as an industry, and what I find is most people fall really closely within what everyone does. It's pretty close. And so I'm not calling anyone individually out, but I may call out the industry as a whole. So how many hours of water do you usually put on, Jesse? 6 or 8 inches of water. So that's from harvest all the way to dormancy. Okay? 6 to 8 inches. Any others? Or hours? I could try and convert that to hours. So Jesse, you're saying about 120 hours. 100 to 120 hours is what I'd say. And I can tell you that a lot of the responses I get to this question is, we probably put on 3 24-hour sets. So, 72, 84 hours, something like that is what they put on. Then I say, well, how long? And they say, oh, I don't know, maybe do 24 hours once a week for 3 weeks after harvest is done. And then they're done for the year. I think that's pretty common. Can anybody speak to that? I'm trying really hard to get you guys to talk. All right. So I think somewhere in this range, so somewhere between 70 hours, 120, 150 hours is kind of what we do from harvest to the end of the year. So that's really what I want to talk about right now, is how much water does it take post-harvest to keep your trees happy, to get them recharged after they've been stressed for months through harvest, and to make it so they can just churn out the sugars and be ready to go in spring. So you can have a spring that's better than what you've had before. So, so a couple things to keep in mind. The trees are still very active. It's still warm. Their leaves are still on. In fact, that's something to keep in mind. As long as the leaves are still on the trees, it's still doing something. It's still working. ET is still an issue. It's still using water every day. And the one thing I think we forget really often is that after months of deficit, we not only need to supply what the tree is using, we also need to refill the soil so the soil's in a good place. Because if you only put a ½ inch of water in, it might be enough to meet ET, but it doesn't mean the tree can get it, because the water is just going to be kind of jealous over it and hold it tight. So I want to show you, we're going to step back a second and look at a few things here. I'm going to exit out of this slideshow for a little bit. Now, if somebody would, what I want to do is I have just a simple calculator here that is going to take into account the soil's needs and the plant's needs post-harvest. And with a little bit of info from one of your farms, we can determine how many hours of water we need just to rehydrate the soil. Now, I'm talking about just getting things back into a good situation post-harvest, not what we need for the rest of the season. So if somebody wouldn't mind, if you could share a location of your field, give me the cross streets here. We'll look it up here and get some soil info off of it. Anybody willing? Delray, and what's that? Right here. All right, perfect. That was not too bad. All right, looks like there's a couple soils here. Let's just take one of these soils. Okay, so you're in a Delhi loamy sand, so it's a lighter soil. So in this soil, it's going to be a little easier to refill because you don't have tons of water to refill. Now, I don't know if you knew this, but you can get soil maps on Google Earth. It's pretty cool. It's way better than the NRCS version. Now, when I look at this, I like to look at this available water storage. Now, this is telling me how much water how many centimeters of water can the soil hold per 100 centimeters of soil. Yeah, I don't know about you, but metric means nothing to me. I have no idea what a centimeter is. So let's make that more useful. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to plug this in, this available water storage. We're going to plug that in at 7. Now, do you know either what your pump puts out or what your irrigation, what the emitters and spacings are? Okay, let's work with the gallons per minute. 800 gallons per minute. Okay, how many acres? 60 acres. Okay, what this is going to do is going to tell us that how much water per hour is putting on. And I think you're right, because that's a really good number. That's pretty typical. So 0.03 inches of water per hour is what you put out. The available water holding capacity is 7 centimeters. Now, the root zone, it's almonds? Peaches. Okay, so peaches, we're going to put in 30 inches for the root zone. They're not quite as deep as the almonds. Now, just for your info here, I put this adjustment in as at 50%. I multiply the amount of water in the soil by this number. I do that for a few reasons. One is the available water storage is the amount of water held in the soil from filled capacity all the way to permanent wilting point. And we don't get to permanent wilting point. Your trees are still alive. So I don't want to count all of that water. On top of that, we don't usually water the entire surface of the field, and our field isn't perfectly uniform. There's a whole bunch of stuff, if you dig into the books, that really are confusing. I try to capture it all with that number, okay? 50% usually does it for me. So what this is telling us here, where it says soil refill, is that the soil alone, in this case, needs a full inch of water, just to refill it down to 30 inches. Okay? What we also want to do is take into account the ET during this period. Okay? So let's take the middle of that. We'll take mid-July for an ET, closest to, oh, where are we? Madera? To Visalia? Okay. Earlier, okay. So we're going to do, so that's the ET per 2 weeks. So let's take half of that. That's 1.74. Everyone good with that? 1.74 inches per week. So that's how much we need to supply to the tree in order for it to have enough. Okay. So what this is calculating for us is right here is in order to refill that soil in a light soil and supply what the tree needs, you need 95 hours of water within a week. Within 1 week, the first week after harvest, in order to rehydrate the soil and get it back up where it should be. So I like that. I think that's pretty good. One thing I do want to point out is this doesn't mean you need 95 hours every week for the rest of the season. This is just what you need to refill. Once the soil is refilled, then you go back to a more typical schedule and just supply it as needed. Right? Does anyone else have a field we could look at? Right here. Okay. Very good. Okay, let's take a look at this soil here. We've got a Grangeville fine sandy loam. You guys like throwing the light soils at me. It's still higher though, so this is good. So 12.9 centimeters. Now, do you know either the pump flow rate or the system's? Should be around 800 gallons a minute. Okay, so let's throw in the soil here. 12.9, 800 gallons per minute. How many acres on a set? 20 acres. So you have a pretty hefty flow rate. That's still within normal. Fan jets, I'm guessing? It's drip line. That's really high. No, that's 2 pumps. It's probably about 500 gallons. 500? Or if you know the spacing and flow rate of those drip lines, we can do it that way. Either way. All right. On almonds, we're going to do 36 inches here. And let's find, we're going to say this is post-harvest. So we're going to do this mid-September. Closest would be Parlier. So 2.05 inches. So that's going to be 1.025, 1.3 per week. All right, for your soil, you only need 61 hours to get it refilled. Now let's just assume the same. I'm going to assume the same top flow rate. I think that's probably more typical what I see in the field. Let's say you have a heavier soil. It's not uncommon to see 17.5 centimeters with the same ET. You see, in that case, you need 142 hours to refill the soil. Okay, now luckily we didn't get anything too crazy. Sometimes I get into this, and the recommendation that comes out is 210 hours in a week. Any problems with that? How many hours are there in a week? It's 168 hours in a week. So it's a little hard to do 210 hours in a week. In fact, 142 hours would be difficult to do in a week. You'd only have a few hours break across the week. So in that case, what we can do is we can spread this out over 2 weeks, and then we have 177 hours over 2 weeks. So 80 hours, 2 weeks in a row, and we can supply ET and refill things. All right? So, so what's your thought on this? Is this as much water as you thought? Is it less water than you thought? What do you think? The reason that this comes up a lot is a lot of times after harvest, we're so dry, we just don't know how much water we need. And it feels like we're putting water on forever and nothing's reacting. And so it's kind of nice to be able to get a rough idea of how much water you need to put it on, and then watch your sensors that are in the field. And so once your sensor is working right, you'll be close. You might need to adjust it by 5 or 10 hours at the end of the end of all of it, but this will get you really close to what you need. The problem I find is that that typically what we do is we get partway there. We put on the 70 hours. We put on something, a couple sets right after harvest, and then we kind of move on to other things, right? So in fact, let's go ahead and go. We can come back to this later if you guys want, but let's go on with the presentation for a minute. All right. So again, I want to point out, now I'm not saying it needs 80 hours a week or 120 hours a week every week from there to the end of the year. That's rehydration. And once you get your soil rehydrated and full, then you go back to watching ET, or you watch your sensors, whatever you have to monitor that, and you just meet the need as it's telling you. So at that point, it might only be 40 hours a week. And because it's the end of the season, it'll get less and less as it gets cooler. It'll get easier. But the point is that as long as those trees have leaves, they're still working. They're still transpiring water, and they need to have that water return. Now, what I see a lot of times is that it doesn't happen, though. So what are the barriers? What do you see on your operations that keep you from following through irrigation all the way to the end of the season?
They don't know.
That's a big part of it.
They just don't know.
Don't understand the importance of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They throw a little bit of water on there and they think they're good.
I know from my experience when I was farming is that by the end of harvest, I'm so butt tired, I don't want to do anything else. I'm ready to go to the beach. I'm ready to wrap things up and to take a rest. And it's well deserved. And I definitely can understand that. Typically as well, what happens is that come the end of harvest, there's a lot of work to do that we've been putting off. I mean, we've thrashed our irrigation systems through harvest. We need to land plane. We need to put on some fertilizer. We need to spray weeds. We really want to get to pruning so that we can slow down a little bit in the winter. And all of that piles on. And guess what interferes with it? Irrigation, muddy fields. And so we just say, you know what? I will irrigate later. I'll take care of it later. I'll put on this little bit and it'll hold it off. I think those are all things that kind of get in the way, and largely because we don't quite get the importance, how important it is to take care of our trees after the harvest. So, so the question is, what can we do? How can we overcome those barriers to make it so that we can really take good care of our trees and then we can get to unheard quality and yield that we've never achieved because we've never taken care of things right in the fall?
They don't want to put any more costs.
Oh, yeah. No more costs. Yep. I want to be done. I got my crop off. It would be nice to have like an end point. So, and I grew up on a dairy farm, so there's no end point. That's when I look at these trees. It's a constant cycle. There's always the next step. I think some of it is slowing down a bit. I think we get really worried about, and our crews, I know our crews really wanting to do a good job for us. They want to get out and get the work done. If we can say slow up a little bit, take these 2 weeks to irrigate it and get it ready, then you can land plane. Then you can spray the weeds. But let's take care of that first, and then we don't have to irrigate as much. Because the truth is, the hotter it is, well, actually, here's a good question. What's the ideal temperature range for plants? Any thoughts on that? Is it 110? No. Yeah, 68, somewhere around there. 70 to 85 degrees is really ideal for a plant. That's when they're the most productive. They're not too hot, they're not too cold. And so, truthfully, late September, October, that's an ideal time for production for those plants. But if we wait till November, it's going to be too cold and things will start slowing down. So we want to get them hydrated and working as soon as we can after harvest to make sure we take advantage of that ideal weather. So a lot of it's just planning. It's about putting some things off that we like to get done, but we can wait just a little bit on. It's about hanging in there just a little bit longer before we take that vacation, and making sure that we get things taken care of. Make sure our crops are still going really well. Now, wanted to just show this. This is a graph from a grower we have, and just to kind of show you what's going on. This blue area is ideal range. That's where we want to keep it. And the higher up we go, the drier it is. And then these vertical bands, those are irrigation events. Okay, so this grower, I was pretty proud of them. They came through harvest. This is really normal to dry out like that during harvest. But we came in and we said, okay, hit it with the water. You got to rehydrate. And this is on a really difficult soil. Does not like taking water at all. So they split it up and they were really intense for weeks. But they were able to get the tension down. They were able to rehydrate the soil. They got it in a good place. But then they got tired of it. Then they took their vacation. And you can see even late September, October, still a lot of water movement, and they lost it. So they got part of the benefit, but they didn't carry through. So that's the trick, though, is that we want to carry through all the way till those leaves fall off. Once the leaves are off, take a break from the water. But until they're on, keep them going. take advantage of all the sugars that they're making. So just in summary, fall irrigation has everything to do with successful spring. If you get to spring and you say, I'd like things to be better this year, you're too late. You got to do it now, because that's when you have the biggest difference that's made. Everything you do in spring with nutrition, that's going to help later in the season, but it won't help with your spring and your bloom. When it comes down to for me, with almond and nut growth, there's only a few stages that really matter. I don't think it really hurts a tree this time of year to be stressed. The nut's already there. It's developed. It's hard. If it's stressed right now, it's going to be okay. We talk a lot in the industry about bud differentiation, right? And we want to make sure we have plenty of buds, and we say, well, we got to have things so that we have plenty of buds. But it's the worst time of year for stress. August, when bud differentiation occurs, everything's dry for almonds. And yet, in the spring, how many blooms do we have? Lots. And how many of those blooms actually turn into nuts? I mean, I've heard as high as 10,000 plus blooms on a tree, but that only 2 to 3%, 30 at the most, actually turn into nuts. So why are we getting so many blooms, but we're not carrying nuts? Or why do we drop nuts? It's likely because we don't have the energy to carry those nuts into full development. So if we can store that in the beginning, use it later in the season, we can maybe get greater amounts of nuts on our tree. So I don't think bud differentiation is the problem. I think sugars, carbohydrates in the tree to keep those blooms is what really matters. And so fall becomes a critical stage. Spring becomes a critical stage after the nuts set. It's okay. Let the stress come there a little bit, but just be prepared to get things back in control. And I really do believe it's worth adjusting other operations to make sure we take good care of that. I think that we'll find huge changes in our industry as we do a little bit better taking care of things in the fall. Thank you.